The streets of New York buzzed with life as Ethan Coleman stepped out of his sleek black sedan, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor, blending with the ever-present aroma of city life, coffee, asphalt, and a hint of rain lingering in the distance. He had spent the entire day in back-to-back meetings, securing yet another deal that would add to his already massive fortune. To the world, Ethan Coleman was a man who had everything: power, wealth, and influence. Yet, as he moved toward the entrance of a high-end restaurant for a business dinner, fate had other plans for him that evening. Just as he reached the crosswalk, something, or rather someone, caught his attention. At first, it was just a blur, an unremarkable scene amid the chaos of the city. But then, his gaze locked onto a figure sitting on the cold pavement, leaning against the brick wall of an old building. A woman, her head bowed, her arms wrapped protectively around two small children. Ethan's steps faltered. His first instinct was to keep moving. He had seen countless homeless people in the city, and though he occasionally donated to charities, he had long since learned to tune out these moments. But something about her made his stomach tighten. She was thin, too thin, her once beautiful brown hair now tangled and lifeless. Her coat was worn, barely thick enough to fight off the encroaching cold. Beside her, two children, no older than 4, huddled close. The little girl pressed her face into her mother's sleeve, while the boy clutched a stuffed rabbit that had long lost its fluff. The woman's trembling fingers gripped a piece of cardboard with scrawled, uneven letters, "Please help, I have 2 children to feed." Then she lifted her head. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He knew that face. Despite the exhaustion lining her features, despite the shadows beneath her once bright eyes, there was no mistaking it. Claire Dawson. The name hit him like a freight train. It had been over a decade, but Ethan would have recognized her anywhere. Back in high school, she had been the girl everyone gravitated toward. The one with an easy smile, a contagious laugh, and a presence that filled the room. She had been effortlessly kind, radiant, untouchable. The girl he had secretly admired, but never had the courage to approach beyond casual conversations. Yet, here she was, sitting on the streets, a shadow of the person she once was. A mix of shock, confusion, and something painfully close to guilt twisted inside him. How had this happened? How had Claire Dawson, the girl who had once seemed destined for so much more, ended up like this? Then their eyes met. For a second, he saw it. Recognition, followed by something else. Shame. She looked away immediately, her shoulders tensing, as if she could will herself into becoming invisible. Ethan felt his heart pound against his ribs. She didn't want him to see her like this. For a brief moment, he hesitated. He could pretend he hadn't noticed. He could turn around, walk into the restaurant, and convince himself that this wasn't his problem. That whatever had happened to her, it wasn't his responsibility to fix. But then, the little girl whimpered, her tiny voice barely carrying over the sound of honking taxis and passing footsteps. "Mommy, I'm hungry." Ethan clenched his jaw. A sharp pang of something unfamiliar, anger, sadness, regret, shot through him. It was one thing to see Claire like this, but her children? The idea of them going to bed hungry, of spending another night out in the cold, was unacceptable. He took a step forward before he could second guess himself. Claire? The woman flinched at the sound of his voice. Slowly, as if dreading what she would see, she turned her head to face him. For a long moment, she said nothing. The weight of 10 years hung between them, unspoken. Then she swallowed hard. Ethan? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but he heard it. It was the same voice he remembered, but it carried something new now. A quiet defeat, a tiredness that went deeper than exhaustion. Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He had spent years negotiating with the most powerful people in the world, sealing billion-dollar deals without hesitation. Yet, standing here, looking at her, he felt utterly lost for words. A cold gust of wind blew through the streets, and Claire instinctively pulled her children closer. The movement was small, but it was enough to snap Ethan out of his daze. What happened to you? He asked, his voice tight. Claire looked away, her fingers curling into the fabric of her coat. It doesn't matter, Ethan exhaled sharply. The hell it doesn't. His sudden intensity made her eyes flicker back to his, but she quickly dropped her gaze. She didn't want him to see the truth. Ethan's hands balled into fists. He had so many questions. Where was the Claire he had known? Where was the girl who had always seemed so full of fire, so unstoppable? How had her life fallen apart so completely? But right now, those answers could wait. Right now, there was something far more important. He looked down at the children, then back at Claire. Come with me. Claire stiffened. No. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Claire, I don't need your help, Ethan, she cut in, her voice firm, despite the way her arms trembled. We're fine. Ethan's eyes darkened. They were not fine. He had seen the way the little girl's lip trembled, the way her son's tiny fingers clutched at his toy like it was all he had left. Ethan knew he couldn't force her, but he also knew he couldn't walk away. So he softened his tone. You don't have to do this alone, Claire. She blinked rapidly, her throat working as she struggled with something. Pride, fear, hesitation. Then her daughter spoke again. Mommy, I'm cold. That was it. Claire exhaled shakily. Then finally, she nodded. Just for tonight, she whispered. Ethan nodded, but in his gut, he knew the truth. This wasn't just for tonight. This was only the beginning. Ethan watched as Claire hesitated, her arms tightening around her children. Her eyes darted between him and the city around them, as if she were calculating the risks of accepting his help. The weight of her pride, her past, and her desperation clashed in the silence between them. He had expected resistance. The Claire he remembered had been strong-willed, never one to accept charity. But this wasn't the same girl from high school. Life had worn her down, stripping away the confidence and certainty she once carried so effortlessly. The little girl, still clutching her mother's coat, let out a soft sniffle, her tiny hands rubbing at her tired eyes. Her brother huddled closer, resting his head against Claire's side. Ethan felt something stir inside him, something deeper than pity, stronger than obligation. Claire exhaled shakily. I don't want to be your problem, Ethan. His jaw tightened. You're not a problem, Claire. If boss said. She let out a humorless laugh. That's easy for you to say. You probably have a life so far removed from this that you can't even imagine how people end up here." She shook her head, her voice raw. "But I do." He could hear it, the resentment, the exhaustion, the quiet shame that clung to her words. She thought she was beyond saving. Ethan crouched down so that they were at eye level. "I'm not asking you to explain yourself. I'm not asking for anything at all." "No." He glanced at the children, then back at her. "I just want to make sure you and your kids are safe tonight." She stared at him, her lips parting slightly before she pressed them together again. He could see the internal war playing out in her eyes. She wanted to refuse, to insist that she could figure it out on her own. But she couldn't, and they both knew it. Claire looked down at her children, then let out a slow, measured breath. "Just for tonight." Ethan nodded. "Just for tonight." His car was parked just a block away, and he led them toward it. Claire hesitated before getting in, her hands hovering over the door handle. She was struggling, her pride telling her to walk away, but her instincts telling her to protect her children at any cost. Eventually, she lifted her daughter into the seat and climbed in, pulling her son onto her lap. Ethan slid into the driver's seat, pressing a button to adjust the temperature. Warm air filled the car, and he caught the way the children immediately sighed in relief, their small bodies relaxing against their mother. As the city lights blurred past the windows, Ethan stole a glance at Claire. She sat stiffly, her arms wrapped around her son as if he might disappear if she let go. "You're safe now," he said, his voice low. Claire let out a soft breath, but didn't reply. The drive to his penthouse was silent, aside from the faint hum of the car's engine. When they pulled into the underground garage, Claire looked around uncertainly. "You live here?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Ethan turned off the engine. "Yeah," Claire scoffed, shaking her head. "This is insane." He opened his door and stepped out, walking around to help her with the kids. She hesitated again, but allowed him to guide them toward the private elevator. The moment the doors slid shut, she tensed. "I don't belong here," she muttered. Ethan met her gaze. "And you don't belong on the streets." She looked away, holding her son a little tighter. When the elevator doors opened, Claire stepped into his penthouse, her expression unreadable as she took in the vast modern space before her. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the New York skyline, the city stretching out in a sea of lights. A sleek fireplace crackled in the corner, filling the room with a welcoming warmth. Ethan saw the way her fingers twitched slightly, the way her posture shifted like she was ready to run. She was out of place here, and she knew it. "Come on," he said gently. "You can rest now." Claire hesitated before following him into the living room. She lowered herself onto the couch cautiously, as if she expected it to disappear beneath her. The kids curled up beside her, their small hands gripping her sweater. Ethan turned toward the kitchen. "I'll get you something to eat." She shook her head quickly. "No, you've done enough." Ethan ignored her, walking to the fridge. He wasn't about to let them go hungry. He grabbed a few things: bread, soup, fruit, simple but warm. When he returned, he placed the tray on the coffee table and sat across from her. She didn't move. "Claire," he said, his voice softer now. "It's okay." She stared at the food for a long moment before reaching for a piece of bread. She tore off a small chunk and handed it to her daughter, then her son. Only once they were eating did she take a bite herself. Ethan watched, something heavy settling in his chest. They were starving. When they were done, Claire wiped her children's faces with the sleeve of her coat. They were visibly fighting off sleep, their little eyes fluttering shut against their will. "They can sleep upstairs," Ethan offered. Claire tensed. "No." He exhaled through his nose. "Claire, the couch isn't. They stay with me." Ethan studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right." She adjusted her position, shifting so the children could lie down with their heads in her lap. Within minutes, their breathing evened out, their small bodies going limp with exhaustion. Claire ran a hand through her daughter's hair absent-mindedly, staring at nothing in particular. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Claire." She didn't respond. "You don't have to do this alone." Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She turned away, blinking rapidly. Ethan let out a slow breath. He didn't know how much she had endured. He didn't know how many nights she had gone to sleep hungry so that her kids could eat. How many times she had swallowed her pride just to get through another day. But he knew one thing. She wasn't alone anymore. Not if he had anything to say about it. The first thing Claire noticed when she woke up was warmth. It wrapped around her like a forgotten luxury, so different from the biting cold that had become her reality. For a moment, she didn't move. She just lay there, her body still aching from exhaustion, listening to the steady breathing of her children curled up beside her. The soft fabric of the couch was unfamiliar, too plush compared to the rough pavement she had spent too many nights on. Then, it all came rushing back. Ethan, the car, the ride through the city, the impossible elegance of his penthouse. Her eyes fluttered open, and she turned her head slightly. Ethan sat in a chair a few feet away, elbows resting on his knees, watching her with unreadable intensity. She tensed. "You stayed here all night?" He shrugged. "Didn't want you to wake up alone in a strange place." She let out a slow breath, shifting slightly so as not to disturb the kids. They were still asleep, their faces relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in years. No flinching at sudden noises, no curling up against the cold, just peace. Ethan noticed her staring at them. "They're safe here, Claire." Her throat tightened, and she turned away. Safe. It wasn't a word she had been able to use in a long time. "I meant what I said last night," he continued. "You don't have to do this alone." She sat up carefully, rubbing her temples. "And I meant what I said too. This was just for one night." His jaw tensed. "Then stay for two." She shot him a look, but he didn't waver. "I have a guest room," he said, leaning back slightly. "It's got a real bed, a door you can lock if it makes you feel better. The kids deserve more than a couch, Claire." Claire exhaled sharply, running a hand over her face. "Ethan, I appreciate what you've done, but I can't just. I'm not asking for anything in return." His voice was calm but firm. No strings, no conditions. She wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could handle it on her own, but deep down, she knew it was a lie. Her children deserved warmth, food, and a chance to rest without fear. She looked at them again, curled up on the couch, their small hands gripping the blankets Ethan had given them. A real bed, a door that locked. It wasn't forever, just until she figured out her next move. She swallowed hard. Fine. 2 nights. A flicker of something passed through Ethan's eyes. Relief, maybe, He nodded. Good. Claire shifted, carefully easing herself off the couch so as not to wake the kids. The moment she stood, she felt the weight of exhaustion settle in her bones. Come on, Ethan said, standing and gesturing for her to follow. I'll show you the room. She hesitated before trailing after him down the hall. The penthouse was impossibly large, with high ceilings and walls lined with art that probably cost more than everything she had ever owned combined. It wasn't just a home, it was a different world. Ethan stopped at a door and pushed it open. Inside was a guest room, bigger than any apartment she had ever rented. A queen-sized bed with crisp white sheets. A closet that was empty except for a fresh set of towels. A private bathroom with gleaming marble countertops. Claire lingered in the doorway, suddenly feeling out of place. This is too much. Ethan shook his head. It's just a room, Claire. Just a room. Just a bed. Just safety. She stepped inside, fingers trailing along the soft fabric of the bedspread. It had been years since she had slept in something this comfortable. Take your time, Ethan said. I'll bring the kids in when they wake up. She turned to look at him. Why are you really doing this? Ethan held her gaze. Because I can. That wasn't the answer she expected. He didn't say, because I feel guilty, or because I owe you, or even because I pity you. He just said it, like it was the simplest thing in the world. Because he could. Claire swallowed past the lump in her throat. I don't know how to accept help. He gave her a small, knowing smile. Then start with this. She let out a shaky breath, finally nodding. He lingered for a moment, as if debating whether to say something more. But then he just turned and left, pulling the door closed behind him. Claire stood in the middle of the room, staring at the unfamiliar comfort surrounding her. The past few years had been filled with so much hardship that she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without the constant weight of survival pressing down on her. She sank down onto the edge of the bed, her fingers gripping the sheets. She told herself she would only stay for 2 nights. But deep down, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure she wanted to leave. Claire stood by the large window in Ethan's penthouse, watching the city come alive as the morning sun cast golden hues over the towering skyline. The glass felt cold under her fingertips, a stark contrast to the warmth she had experienced last night, the first night in years where she had fallen asleep without fear, without listening for threats lurking in the shadows. She could hear the faint laughter of Harper and Oliver from the next room, their voices lighter, freer. They had slept in a real bed, eaten a warm meal, and for once, they didn't wake up to the unforgiving reality of the streets. But Claire couldn't shake the unease settling in her chest. This wasn't her life. This wasn't where she belonged. She had spent so long fighting to survive that accepting kindness, especially from someone like Ethan, felt unnatural, like a trick waiting to unfold. Couldn't sleep? Ethan's voice came from behind her. Claire turned to find him standing in the doorway, looking as composed as ever in his dark gray sweater and fitted slacks, a coffee cup in hand. He looked completely at ease in this space. His space. Unlike her. I slept fine, she lied, wrapping her arms around herself. Just thinking. Ethan studied her for a moment, then stepped into the room, setting his coffee down on the marble counter. Thinking about what? Claire hesitated. She didn't owe him an explanation, yet something about the way he looked at her, like he actually cared about the answer, made her consider telling him the truth. Finally, she exhaled. About what happens next? Ethan nodded slowly. And? And I don't know, she admitted, her voice quieter now. I've been living day to day for so long that I don't know how to plan beyond surviving the next 24 hours. Ethan leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. Then let's start there. What do you need? Claire blinked at him, caught off guard. No one had asked her that in a long time. People had offered judgment, pity, or assumptions, but never a direct question with the intent to listen. I need to get back on my feet, she said, voice firmer this time. Find a job. Get a place for me and the kids. I can't just stay here forever. Ethan nodded as if considering something. I can help with that. Claire tensed. Ethan, I know, he interrupted before she could protest. You don't want handouts. I'm not offering one. I'm offering a chance. A real one. She narrowed her eyes. And what's the catch? No catch. His voice was calm but unwavering. I just want to know what happened to you, Claire. Her stomach twisted. She had known this conversation would come eventually. Ethan was giving her a lifeline, but he wanted something in return. Answers. She turned back to the window, watching a bird soar effortlessly between the buildings. It's not a story people like to hear. I'm not people, Ethan countered. She hesitated, fingers gripping the windowsill. She could still say no, still keep her past locked away where it belonged. But the weight of carrying it alone had become unbearable. She took a shaky breath. I thought I had everything figured out after high school. I got into a good college, had plans, dreams, and then I met Matthew. Ethan's jaw clenched at the name, though he stayed silent. Claire let out a bitter chuckle. I thought he was the one. He made promises, talked about a future, and I believed him. I trusted him. She shook her head. I was an idiot. Ethan didn't interrupt, though she could feel his gaze burning into her. By the time I realized who he really was, it was too late. He was controlling, manipulative, the kind of man who smiles in public but turns into someone else behind closed doors. She wrapped her arms around herself as if trying to shield from the memories. I told myself I could fix it, that if I just did everything right, he would change. Ethan's hands curled into fists. Did he hurt you? Claire flinched slightly at the question, but she nodded. Not at first. It started with words, little ways he made me doubt myself. Then the isolation. Then the fear. She swallowed hard. When I found out I was pregnant, I thought it would change him, that maybe being a father would make him a better man. Ethan let out a slow, controlled breath, his expression unreadable. But it didn't. No, she whispered. It got worse, much worse. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Claire stared down at her hands. I stayed longer than I should have. I thought leaving would be harder than staying. But one night, when Oliver was just a few months old, Matthew got angry. Really angry. And her voice cracked, and she closed her eyes, willing herself to stay composed. He almost hurt my son. Ethan's expression darkened, his body rigid, with barely contained rage. That was the moment I knew I had to run, Claire continued. I grabbed the kids and whatever I could fit in a single bag, and left in the middle of the night. No money, no plan, just fear. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low and rough. "Did you ever report him?" She let out a hollow laugh. "To who?" "He was smart, Ethan. He covered his tracks, made sure no one would believe me if I tried. And even if I did, the system isn't built for women like me. I had no money, no family to turn to, just two babies who needed me to survive." Ethan's chest rose and fell in steady, controlled breaths, but Claire could see the fire behind his eyes. "I ended up on the streets, bouncing from shelters to temporary jobs. Every time I thought we were getting close to stability, something would go wrong. And eventually, we ended up here." She gestured vaguely, her voice thick with exhaustion. "Begging on a street corner, hoping someone would take pity on us." Ethan stared at her for a long time, his face unreadable. Then, finally, he spoke. "You're never going back to that," he said, his voice steel. Claire let out a sharp breath. "Ethan, I mean it," he said, stepping closer. "You're not alone anymore, Claire. And that bastard, he doesn't get to haunt you forever." Something in his tone made her pause. There was no pity in his voice, no condescension, only conviction. Claire swallowed past the lump in her throat. "I don't know how to trust that." Ethan nodded, as if he expected that answer. "Then let me prove it to you." She wanted to argue, to insist that she didn't need saving. But for the first time in years, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't standing on the edge of survival alone. And that terrified her more than anything. Claire wasn't used to kindness. Not the kind that lingered, the kind that didn't demand something in return. She had learned long ago that people only offered help when they expected repayment, and nothing in this world came for free. So, as she moved through Ethan's penthouse, watching the way he interacted with her children, patient, attentive, almost effortlessly, she felt something unfamiliar stir inside her. She wanted to believe this was real, but trust was a fragile thing, and hers had been broken too many times before. The day had started quietly. The children had woken up later than usual, their bodies finally allowed to rest without the tension of survival weighing on them. Claire had helped them get dressed in clothes Ethan had somehow managed to provide, the fabric softer and warmer than anything they had worn in years. Now, as they sat in the living room, Harper and Oliver were drawing with crayons on a stack of blank papers Ethan had left out for them. Claire watched them from the couch, her fingers curled around a steaming mug of coffee Ethan had placed in her hands moments earlier. "You don't have to hover," she murmured, glancing at him as he settled into the chair across from her. "I'm not hovering," he said, taking a sip from his own cup. "I'm just existing in the same space." She rolled her eyes, but the corner of her mouth twitched. "Feels like hovering." Ethan smirked, but didn't argue. A comfortable silence settled between them. Claire wasn't sure when that had started happening, when the silences stopped feeling heavy, stopped feeling like gaps waiting to be filled with explanations or apologies. "They like you, you know," she said after a while, nodding toward the kids. Ethan looked over at them, his expression softening. Harper was intensely focused on coloring in a drawing of what looked like a lopsided cat, while Oliver scribbled wildly, creating something that could only be described as chaos on paper. "They're great kids," he said simply. Claire exhaled, a strange tightness in her chest. I don't know if I've done right by them. Ethan's gaze snapped back to her. What? She let out a slow breath, running a hand through her hair. I mean, they deserve so much more than what I've been able to give them. A stable home, a normal life. Not, she gestured vaguely, not this, not sleeping in shelters, and wondering where their next meal is coming from. Ethan set his coffee down, leaning forward. Claire, you kept them safe. You gave them love when everything else was falling apart. That's more than most people can say. She swallowed hard, staring into her cup. It doesn't feel like enough. For them, it is. She glanced at the children again. Oliver had crawled into Harper's lap, and despite her protests, he had somehow convinced her to let him help with her drawing. His chubby fingers gripped a blue crayon as he added random scribbles to her carefully drawn lines. Harper groaned in frustration, but she didn't push him away. Claire's heart ached at the sight. She had spent so long fighting, so long barely holding it together, that she hadn't stopped to appreciate how resilient her children were. They had lost so much, yet they still found ways to smile, to trust, to find joy in something as simple as a box of crayons. She turned back to Ethan, her throat tight. Why are you doing this? His brow furrowed slightly. Doing what? Helping us, letting us stay here. You don't owe me anything. Ethan was quiet for a moment, as if carefully choosing his words. Then he said, because I can. She exhaled sharply. That's not an answer. He ran a hand through his hair. Because I know what it's like to feel alone, to think that no one is coming to help. She blinked at him, caught off guard. Ethan Bennett had always seemed untouchable, like someone who had been born into a world where things simply worked out in his favor. She had never considered that he might have his own ghosts. What happened? She asked quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. My father left when I was a kid. My mother did her best, but it wasn't enough. She worked 2 jobs, barely slept. I spent a lot of time wondering if we'd make it to the next month. And then she got sick. Claire's breath caught. Ethan exhaled slowly, staring down at his hands. I was 17. She passed before I could do anything to help. After that, I made a promise to myself that if I ever got out, if I ever made something of myself, I wouldn't turn my back on people who needed help. Claire didn't know what to say. She had spent years thinking she was alone in her suffering, convinced that no one else could possibly understand what it felt like to lose everything. But Ethan wasn't just some untouchable millionaire offering pity. He was someone who had been on the other side of desperation. She swallowed hard. I'm sorry. He shook his head. Don't be. It's in the past. Claire glanced at the children again, her mind racing. Maybe, just maybe, Ethan wasn't just another person passing through her life. Maybe he understood in a way no one else ever had. And maybe, for the first time in a long time, she wasn't as alone as she thought. The city outside Ethan's penthouse was alive with lights and movement, but inside, everything was still. Claire sat at the kitchen island, fingers wrapped around a glass of water, staring at the reflection of the city in the window. It had been days since she and the kids arrived here, and yet she still felt like a guest in someone else's world. Like at any moment, she'd wake up on a cold sidewalk and realize this had all been a dream. Ethan entered the room, his footsteps soft against the marble floor. He placed his phone down on the counter and leaned against the opposite side, studying her. Can't sleep? Claire shook her head. Too many thoughts. Ethan poured himself a drink and sat down across from her. Want to talk about them? She exhaled, considering his offer. Over the past few days, she had felt something shifting between them. Something unspoken, but undeniable. Ethan had been patient, never pressing for more than she was willing to give. But tonight, something in the air felt different. I still don't know why you're doing this, she admitted. Ethan took a sip of his drink before setting the glass down. I told you, because I can. She shook her head. That's not the real reason. He studied her for a long moment. And what do you think the real reason is? Claire hesitated. I think you saw me on that sidewalk and something about it got to you. Maybe it reminded you of something. Maybe it made you feel like you owed me, even though you don't. She looked up at him. But I don't understand why you're still here. Why you keep trying. Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. Because I want to. Claire narrowed her eyes. Why? He was quiet for a moment. Then finally he spoke. Because I know what it's like to feel forgotten, he said, to need help and have no one to turn to. Claire frowned. You're a millionaire, Ethan. You have everything. He let out a dry laugh. You think I've always had this? He gestured around the penthouse. I built this from nothing, Claire. When my mother died, I was 17 and alone. No family, no safety net, just me trying to survive. She swallowed hard, caught off guard by the rare vulnerability in his voice. I worked 3 jobs just to keep myself afloat, he continued. I spent nights sleeping in my car because I couldn't afford rent. I know what it's like to be hungry, to feel like the world is stacked against you. His eyes met hers. So when I saw you that night, I couldn't just walk away. Claire's grip tightened around her glass. I don't know how to accept that. Ethan tilted his head slightly. Why? She let out a hollow laugh. Because people don't help without expecting something in return. Every time someone offered me kindness, there was always a cost. I don't know how to trust that you're different. Ethan's expression didn't change. Then let me prove it to you. She looked away, staring down at the water in her glass. I don't even know who I am anymore, Ethan. I've spent so long just trying to survive that I don't know what I want, what I need. He leaned forward slightly. Then start with this. Start with right now. What do you need? She hesitated, the words sticking in her throat. But then, quietly, she said, to feel safe. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. Then that's what I'll give you. Claire looked up at him, searching his face for deception, for an angle. But there was nothing there except honesty. For the first time in years, she felt something close to hope, and it terrified her. Claire had spent years running, from the past, from fear, from the man who had nearly broken her. But no matter how far she had gone, Matthew's presence still haunted her, lingering like a shadow just beyond her reach. Even here, in the safety of Ethan's penthouse, she felt it, the weight of unfinished business pressing against her chest. Ethan noticed the change in her before she even said a word. Over the past few days, Claire had been quieter, more withdrawn. She had started sleeping with one hand always near the edge of the bed, as if expecting to wake up somewhere else entirely. So, when he walked into the living room one evening and found her staring out at the city, her shoulders tense, He knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked. Claire didn't turn around. "I need to face him." Ethan's entire body went rigid. "No." She turned then, meeting his gaze. "I have to." Ethan shook his head, stepping closer. "Claire, you don't owe him anything. You don't need to see him. You don't need closure from a man like that." Her hands curled into fists at her sides. "This isn't about him. This is about me. I need to know that he doesn't own any part of me anymore. I need to see him one last time and walk away on my own terms." Ethan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. He understood what she was saying, but the thought of her standing face to face with the man who had hurt her made his blood boil. "Claire, I've spent years hiding," she interrupted, her voice steady but raw. "I don't want to be afraid anymore. And if I don't do this, I'll always feel like he still has control over my life." Ethan clenched his jaw. He wanted to protect her, to keep her from ever having to see that bastard again. But he also knew Claire, knew her strength, her stubbornness. "You're not going alone," he said finally. She let out a small breath, as if she had been expecting his resistance but relieved that he hadn't tried to change her mind. The next afternoon, Ethan made the call. It hadn't been hard to find Matthew. Men like him never changed. They thrived on control, on intimidation, and when they lost their victims, they clung to whatever power they had left. The meeting was set for a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her coffee cup. But when Matthew walked through the door, her spine straightened. He hadn't changed much. His hair was slightly thinner, his features sharper with age, but the way he carried himself, the arrogance, the smirk that barely concealed the cruelty beneath, was exactly the same. "You look different," Matthew said, sliding into the seat across from her. His gaze flickered toward Ethan, who stood just a few feet away, arms crossed, watching like a silent guardian. Claire ignored the comment. "I didn't come here for small talk." Matthew chuckled. "Then why are we here?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Because I want you to know that you have no power over me anymore." His smirk faltered for just a second. "That's so," Claire nodded. "You don't scare me, not anymore. I took my kids and left, and we're better off without you. And I need you to understand that I will never let you near them, ever." Matthew leaned back, studying her with a calculating gaze. "You think you can keep me away from them forever?" Ethan stepped forward then, his presence looming over the table. His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. "Yes." Matthew glanced between them, his smirk returning. But there was something different in his eyes now. Uncertainty. He had expected the same Claire he once controlled. Instead, he was facing a woman who had rebuilt herself. Claire stood, her voice steady. "This is the last time we will ever speak." She turned, walking out without another word. Ethan followed closely, but she didn't need him to guide her. For the first time in years, she felt weightless, like she had finally severed the last tie binding her to the past, and it felt like freedom. The weight that had sat on Claire's shoulders for years felt lighter now. Facing Matthew had been terrifying, but walking away from him, on her own terms, had been liberating. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was no longer running from something but toward something instead. But freedom came with its own complications. And now, standing in Ethan's penthouse, she realized that she had another decision to make, one that could change everything. Ethan had given her and the kids safety, a home, and a sense of stability she had never thought possible. And in return, she had let herself trust him more than she had ever trusted anyone. But trust was one thing, staying was another. She knew what people would think, that she was taking advantage, that she was just another woman clinging to a man with money because it was easier than fighting on her own. She had spent years convincing herself that she didn't need anyone, that needing someone was dangerous. But then there was Ethan. He had never once made her feel like a burden, never once looked at her with pity. He had seen her at her lowest, and instead of pulling away, he had simply stood beside her, waiting for her to decide what she wanted. And now she had to decide. She was packing a small bag when Ethan found her. He stood in the doorway of the guest room, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Going somewhere? Claire hesitated, gripping the zipper of the bag a little too tightly. I need to think. Ethan nodded, stepping further into the room. About what? She exhaled. About what comes next. About whether I stay here or whether I start figuring things out on my own. Ethan studied her carefully. You don't have to leave to figure that out, Claire. She looked up at him, frustration flickering in her gaze. Don't I? Every time someone has helped me, it's come with strings attached. I don't know how to trust that this is different. His jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained steady. It is different. She let out a shaky breath. I want to believe that. Then believe it, he said simply. Claire turned away, staring at the half-packed bag. If I stay, I need to know that this isn't just about you trying to fix me, that I'm not some project you feel obligated to see through. Ethan was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. You're not a project, Claire, and I don't want you to stay because you feel like you have to. I want you to stay because you want to. Her throat tightened. And if I don't? Ethan's expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something vulnerable. Then I'll still make sure you and the kids have everything you need. I meant what I said. I'm not here to trap you. Claire swallowed hard. He was giving her something she had never been given before, a choice. No ultimatums, no manipulation. Just a door that remained open, whether she chose to walk through it or not. She let out a slow breath. I don't want to run anymore. Ethan stepped closer, his voice soft. Then don't. For the first time in years, Claire wasn't making a choice based on fear. She wasn't leaving because she had to. She was staying because deep down, she wanted to. The sun had just begun to rise, casting a warm golden glow across the city skyline. Claire stood by the window of Ethan's penthouse, a cup of coffee in her hands, watching as the world slowly came to life below. For the first time in years, she wasn't waking up to uncertainty or fear. There was no rush to find shelter before nightfall, no worry about where their next meal would come from. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was living. Behind her, soft laughter echoed through the apartment. Harper and Oliver were already up, their small feet padding across the hardwood floors as they chased each other around the couch. Ethan was in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, watching them with a faint smile. Claire turned to face him, studying the way he fit so effortlessly into this moment. It still didn't feel real sometimes. That someone like him had opened his life to them, not out of obligation, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. You're staring, Ethan said without looking up. Claire smirked, taking a slow sip of her coffee. I guess I am. He set down his cup and walked toward her, stopping just a few inches away. Something on your mind? She hesitated for a moment before exhaling softly. It's just this, all of it. I never thought I'd have something like this again. Ethan studied her, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. You deserve this, Claire. She shook her head, her fingers tightening around the warm ceramic mug. I don't know if I do. Ethan reached out, gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. You do, and so do they. He nodded toward Harper and Oliver, who were now collapsed in a fit of giggles on the couch. You fought for them, for so long. Now let yourself have something too. Claire swallowed the lump in her throat. It's not that easy. I know. Ethan's voice was calm, steady, but we take it one day at a time. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, this was real. That this wasn't temporary. That she wasn't just another passing moment in someone else's life. A tiny tug on her sleeve pulled her from her thoughts. Claire looked down to find Oliver staring up at her with wide, sleepy eyes. Mommy, are we staying here forever? He asked, rubbing his eyes with his little fists. Claire crouched down, brushing his hair back gently. She felt Ethan watching her, waiting for her answer, but she already knew what it was. She smiled, pressing a soft kiss to Oliver's forehead. Yeah, sweetheart, we're staying. Harper clapped her hands excitedly, and Oliver grinned before running back to the couch. Claire slowly stood, her heart pounding as she met Ethan's gaze. Forever, huh? He murmured. Claire let out a breathless laugh. Yeah, I think so. Ethan smiled, reaching for her hand, and for the first time in a long, long time, Claire wasn't afraid of the future. She wasn't waiting for something to go wrong. She was just here, with them, with him. And it was enough. Claire's journey was never just about finding a home. It was about finding herself again, about breaking free from the chains of her past and embracing the possibility of a future she never thought she deserved. It was about trust, love, and the courage to let someone in after years of believing she had to face the world alone. At the heart of this story lies a powerful truth. Everyone, no matter how broken they feel, is worthy of a second chance. Claire spent years fighting against a world that seemed determined to push her down, carrying the weight of survival on her shoulders, never daring to hope for more. And then came Ethan, not as a savior, but as a reminder that she was not alone, that she had never been alone. Ethan didn't fix Claire. He didn't swoop in with money and solutions and make everything perfect. What he did was much more important. He gave her space to heal. He gave her the security to dream again. He showed her, through patience and unwavering support, that love wasn't about control or obligation. It was about choosing to stand by someone day after day, even when they weren't ready to believe in themselves yet. Claire's struggle to trust again mirrors something we all face at some point in our lives. Pain leaves scars, and those scars make it hard to believe in kindness, in love, in the idea that someone could care without expecting something in return. But just because we have been hurt before doesn't mean we are doomed to a life of solitude. Healing is possible, but only if we let ourselves open up to it. Perhaps one of the most touching elements of this story is the role of Harper and Oliver. These two children, innocent and full of wonder, were the reason Claire kept fighting. They were her motivation, her driving force. And yet, in the end, it was they who taught her the most valuable lesson. Through their laughter, their unconditional love, and their ability to trust Ethan so easily, they showed Claire that love doesn't have to be complicated, that sometimes the simplest things, like feeling safe, like having someone to share breakfast with, like knowing you have a place to belong, are the most important. Ethan's character is just as significant. He wasn't perfect. He didn't have all the answers. But he had something far more valuable: the willingness to stay. In a world where so many people walk away when things get difficult, Ethan remained. He didn't push Claire to open up before she was ready. He didn't force her to accept help. He simply made it clear that no matter what happened, she wouldn't have to face it alone. And that, more than anything else, is what allowed Claire to take the risk of trusting again. Love, in its truest form, is not about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It's about the quiet moments, the ones where someone chooses to show up for you, even when you're at your worst. It's about patience, understanding, and the unwavering belief that no matter how broken someone feels, they are still whole in the eyes of the people who love them. Claire's story also serves as a testament to resilience. She could have given up at any point. She could have let the weight of the past crush her, could have chosen to believe that happiness wasn't meant for her. But she didn't. Even when she was scared, even when she doubted herself, she kept moving forward. And that is the greatest lesson of all. Life does not always go the way we expect. Sometimes it shatters us. Sometimes it takes us to places we never imagined, forcing us to start over when we thought we had nothing left to give. But just like Claire, we are all capable of rebuilding. We are all worthy of love, of safety, of a place to belong. And no matter how many times we fall, there is always a way to rise again. So if you are reading this and you feel lost, if you are struggling to believe that things can get better, let Claire's story be a reminder. You are not alone. There are people who care, people who will stand by you, people who will remind you that your past does not define you. And most importantly, there is still hope. Now, we would love to hear from you. What part of Claire's journey resonated with you the most? Did her struggles remind you of a time in your own life? What lessons will you take with you after reading this story? Rate this story from 0 to 10 in the comments below and let us know how it made you feel. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful and inspiring story. Your support helps us continue creating content that touches hearts and changes lives. Thank you for being part of this journey. And remember, no matter how lost you feel right now, your story is not over. A new beginning is always within reach.